Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Truscott. Today we'll be talking about the tragic crash of a Cessna Citation 550 jet at the French Valley Airport in Southern California over the weekend. And in particular, we'll talk about what instrument pilots can learn from the accident. Specifically, we'll talk about flying an approach when the weather is below minimums, and about when you might fly a second approach if you don't see the airport on your first approach. Last week in episode 281, we talked with Catherine Cavagnaro about the myth of the 70-50 takeoff rule and what's wrong with it. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/281. And so you don't miss next week's episode, in whatever app that you're using to listen to me now, take a moment right now, find the subscribe key or the follow key if you're using the Apple Podcast app, so that next week's episode is downloaded for free. And this is a listener-supported show, so if you've ever learned something from this show that has helped you become a safer pilot, or maybe even to help pass a check ride, think about what you might pay a CFI for an hour of ground instruction and make a donation to help support the show. To do that, just go to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome to sign up and make a monthly donation, or to make a one-time donation, go to aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. And of course, those links are in the episode description in the podcast app that you're listening to now. Now let's talk about the crash of the Cessna Citation 550 at the French Valley Airport in Southern California. The reason pilots talk about accidents is so we can learn from them and hopefully not repeat any mistakes that led to those accidents. At the heart of this accident is pilot decision-making. And as we talk about it, I want you to think about two things. First, as an instrument pilot, would there be any circumstances in which you would elect to fly an instrument approach when the weather is slightly below minimums? And second, if you were to fly an approach and didn't see the airport, how would you decide whether to fly a second approach to that airport or to divert to another airport with better weather? Most of what we'll talk about today is factual data, such as the aircraft's flight path and the reported weather at the time. We'll of course know even more about the accident a year or two from now when the NTSB issues their final report. I sometimes talk in detail about an accident soon after it occurs, as we'll do today, rather than wait a year for the final NTSB report. And that's because even though we may not know the exact reason for a particular accident, we can still talk about the multiple reasons that an accident may have occurred. And one of the goals of this podcast is to help pilots fly more safely, and there's value in highlighting the multiple issues that might have caused an accident, rather than the one cause of an accident that happened a year or two ago. Now, I first learned about this accident early Saturday morning while reading the news on my phone. That's when I read that a jet had crashed less than 3 hours before at 4:14 a.m. The first photos I saw of rescue vehicles were shrouded in fog, suggesting that weather was a factor. There's a lot that we won't know about this accident, especially about the pilots, their experience level, and how much rest they'd had before the flight. But even at this early stage, it's apparent that weather was a major factor and that the plane descended rapidly below the glide slope in the last few seconds and crashed about 500 feet short of the runway. The pilots flew two approaches to their destination, the French Valley Airport, F70, which is located 50 nautical miles north of the San Diego International Airport. French Valley has a 6,000-foot runway that's 75 feet wide, and it sits at an elevation of about 1,350 feet. It has one instrument approach, the RNAV GPS 18 approach that comes in from the north, and that approach has minimums of 7/8 of a mile visibility and 1,600 feet MSL, which is 250 feet above the airport. After flying their first approach to minimums, the pilots decided to go around and flew the published missed approach. The second approach flew virtually the same track. In fact, the two tracks were so close together that I had difficulty separating the data for each track when I viewed the data on adsbexchange.com. And I want to thank Dan at adsbexchange.com, who exported the ADSB data for this flight and sent it to me over the weekend so that I could see the raw data. That data contained far more detail than I can find on other popular flight tracking sites. With the data that Dan sent me, I had far more data points and I could view aircraft altitudes down to virtually the runway. So I got a remarkably clear picture of what happened. But before we talk about the final moments of the flight, let's talk more about the aircraft, the company that owned it, the pilots, and the kind of flying the plane did during the last few days leading up to the crash. The accident aircraft was November 819 Kilo Romeo, a 1979 Cessna 550 Citation jet. It was owned by a company called Prestige Worldwide Flights, LLC. According to a database of California corporations, the company was created about a year ago in May 2022. 4 months earlier, in January 2022, another company listing the same address was founded under the name Fly By Night, LLC. Now, I've checked the FAA database of Part 135 charter companies, and neither of these company names appear on that list. So most likely this aircraft was not being used for charter at the time of the crash, though perhaps that was the long-term planned use of the aircraft. According to the FAA database, the accident aircraft was registered on November 16, 2022, which is most likely when it was purchased, though it's hard to know for sure, as there's a chance that that date was when the aircraft registration was renewed. But that seems unlikely, as the company that owned the aircraft had only been in business for less than 6 months at the time of the registration. There were 2 pilots aboard the aircraft. One was 25 years old and the other was 32 years old. Both pilots had commercial certificates with multi-engine and instrument ratings. Both pilots also had CE 500 type ratings, so they were most likely legally qualified to operate the aircraft. Both type ratings carried the limitation CE 500 second in command required, so neither of them could fly the plane alone. They had to have a second pilot on board. The pilot certificate for the 25-year-old pilot was issued on April 10, 2023, less than 3 months before the crash. It's quite likely that is the date when he got his CE 500 type rating, though we won't know for sure until the NTSB report comes out. The 32-year-old pilot had his pilot certificate issued on April 11, 2022, so he was probably type rated in the citation at least 15 months before the accident. Neither pilot had any other type ratings. Now, the flights in the last few days leading up to the crash have all the hallmarks of training flights and resemble some of the flights I've done in the past while teaching in the Cirrus Vision Jet. For example, on Wednesday, July 5th, the aircraft flew 5 legs, most of which were about an hour long or less, to airports in California and adjacent states. The time on the ground between these flights was short, just long enough to either refuel or perhaps just to pick up a new clearance and depart on the next leg. These were all daytime flights in which the pilots likely encountered very little weather. On Thursday, July 6th, the aircraft flew 3 similar legs. On Friday, the day before the accident, there were no daytime flights. However, the 2 pilots did depart on Friday night from the French Valley Airport at 9:18 p.m., arriving at the Las Vegas airport at 10:04 p.m. They spent about 5 hours on the ground in Las Vegas before departing at 3:16 a.m. to return to the French Valley Airport. In addition to the 2 pilots, there were 3 other people on board, including the wife of the older pilot and an older couple who lived in the same town as the older pilot. For most of the time the pilots were in Vegas, the weather remained clear at French Valley Airport, so they may have thought they'd have an easy arrival on a clear night, but that was not to be the case. At 3:35 a.m., about 20 minutes after the plane departed Las Vegas, the weather at French Valley was still reported to be winds at 120 at 3, visibility 10 miles, sky clear, temperature 12, dew point 10, altimeter 2985. The only worrisome part would have been a temperature dew point spread of just 2 degrees, suggesting that fog or low clouds could form, which is indeed what happened. Here are the radio calls the accident aircraft made at Harry Reid International Airport in Las Vegas, starting with getting its clearance through takeoff and the handoff to departure. Unfortunately, the aircraft transmissions, when it was on the ground, are a little garbled, probably because of the location on the antenna used by Live ATC to pick up these transmissions. You can hear the aircraft more clearly after it departs. There was one subtle error this crew made during those transmissions that suggests either a lack of experience at a large Class B airport or perhaps pilot fatigue. I'll tell you about it after we listen to the radio calls. Also, it sounds like the controller is sometimes referring to the aircraft as a station error, which is a piston Cessna 206, though the aircraft is, of course, a Cessna Citation. Here are the transmissions.
Station 819 Kilo Lima, Las Vegas Tower, switch to Foxtrot 70 Airport, radar to departure. Active transition, as filed. Climb to the SID, squawk 4733.
Airport radar 2, active transition as filed. Climb to the SID, squawk 4733.
Station 9 kilometer back, correct. Did you want 18, flight level 180 as the final?
Yeah, we can do 180.
Station 9 Kilo Romeo, Roger. Climb via the SID, accept, maintain, flight level 180.
Yeah, accept, 180, flight level 180.
Kilo Romeo, runway on the right, taxi to be hotel.
One on right, the hotel.
Station 9 Kilo Romeo, reset the transponder squawk 4733, 4733. Are you ready to go?
Ready to go.
Number 9 Kilo Romeo, wind 170 at 5, runway 1 on the right. What's for takeoff?
Right, clear for takeoff.
Citation 9 Kilo Romeo, contact departure, good morning.
Departure, good morning, 819 Kilo Romeo. Hey, can I get that frequency for 819 Kilo Romeo?
125.9.
Is that 25.9, 819 Kilo Romeo?
Affirmative.
Have a good night.
Did you notice at the end that the pilot asked what the departure frequency was? Typically at smaller airports, that frequency would have been given during the clearance on the ground, but the controller didn't give a departure frequency on the ground, and the crew didn't ask for it when it was omitted. The reason it wasn't given is that the departure procedure chart for some large airports, including Las Vegas, lists both the tower and departure frequencies to be used on the chart, and pilots are expected to read the chart to find the frequencies there. Apparently, this crew didn't do that. It's a minor mistake, but it suggests perhaps either unfamiliarity with operating out of larger airports or maybe pilot fatigue. Unfortunately, live ATC doesn't have local receivers in place to capture the approach control frequency or the CTAF frequency at French Valley Airport, so I wasn't able to hear those conversations. But it's clear from the flight path that the crew asked for and received the RNAV GPS 18 approach into French Valley. The weathercams.faa.gov website has historical METAR data for the French Valley Airport, but while the AWOS data would have been updated in real time every minute, the historical data I found is not recorded every minute, so we don't know for sure when the weather changed from VFR to IFR. But we do know that change occurred relatively late in the flight. The last recorded time at which the field was still reporting VFR was at 4:35 a.m., about 20 minutes after the aircraft departed Las Vegas and 23 minutes before the aircraft began its first missed approach. The first recorded time at which the field was reporting IFR was 20 minutes later at 4:55 a.m., which was just 3 minutes before the crew started their first missed approach. So sometime between 4:35 and 4:55 a.m., the field went IFR, meaning the crew didn't know the field had gone IFR until they got relatively close to their destination. They had probably planned all along to fly an instrument approach, since that's the prudent thing to do when landing at night, but they probably hadn't counted on doing a landing where the weather was actually slightly below the minimums for the approach. The weather reported at 4:55 a.m., 3 minutes before their first missed approach, was winds calm, visibility 3/4 of a mile, mist, overcast 300, temperature 11, dew point 11, altimeter 29.85. However, the minimums for the approach are 7/8 of a mile visibility and 1,600 feet MSL, which is 250 feet AGL. So the clouds were 50 feet above the minimums, but the visibility was 1/8 of a mile below the required 7/8 of a mile visibility. Now, had this been a charter flight, I don't believe the crew would have been legally allowed to conduct the approach to take a peek and see how good the weather actually was. But since it was most likely a Part 91 or personal flight, the crew was allowed to fly the approach and hope that the flight visibility might be slightly better than the visibility recorded by the AWOS station on the ground, and that they might see the runway and be able to land. Now, you might be asking why, if this was a GPS approach with LPV minimums, why were the minimums not the same as a typical ILS, which are a half-mile visibility and 200 feet AGL? There are a couple reasons why the minimums at French Valley are higher than those found on a typical ILS. First, most ILS systems have an approach lighting system associated with them. These are a series of signal lights that start at the runway threshold and extend back into the approach area for a distance of 2,400 to 3,000 feet for precision instrument runways. Technically, an ILS is not required to have an approach lighting system, but virtually all of them do. For a standard Cat 1 ILS with an approach lighting system, the typical visibility minimum is 1/2 mile. However, if there is no approach lighting system, the visibility minimums have to be at least 3/4 of a mile. As you may have guessed, there is no approach lighting system at French Valley, so 3/4 of a mile would be the lowest allowed visibility minimum. Also, the RNAV GPS approach at French Valley has 250-foot minimums, not the 200-foot minimums found on many ILS approaches. When the FAA first started creating approaches with LPV minimums about, maybe 20 years ago, the lowest minimums allowed at that time were 250 feet AGL. Years later, the FAA permitted LPV minimums to be charted as low as 200 feet AGL. However, their policy at the time was to not go back and rechart the older LPVs with 250-foot minimums to 200-foot minimums unless there was, quote, an operational benefit to doing so. Typically, all of the LPVs at major airports served by the airlines were recharted to 200-foot minimums, but that didn't happen at smaller airports such as French Valley. When an aircraft flies to minimums that are 250 feet AGL, the aircraft will be about 0.15 nautical miles or about 900 feet farther away from the airport than an aircraft flying to minimums at 200 feet AGL. So to be able to see the airport from the missed approach point, an aircraft flying to 250-foot minimums has to have better visibility than an aircraft flying to 200-foot minimums because it's farther away from the airport. Regardless, the pilots certainly knew or should have known that they would be flying an approach that was slightly below minimums, and that it would be total luck at the flight visibility, which is the distance a pilot can see from the cockpit, would be better than that reported by the AWOS and that they might be able to land. Now let's talk about the altitudes at which the aircraft flew its two approaches. The altitudes transmitted by ADS-B are in meters, not feet, and therefore pressure altitude, which is the altitude that you read when you set an altimeter to 29.92. The local pressure at French Valley at the time of the accident was 29.85. So to get the correct altitude, after converting from meters to feet, I needed to subtract 70 feet from the altitudes reported on the ADSBExchange.com website. And I was able to verify that these altitudes were fairly accurate, as ADSB Exchange picked up data from the aircraft when it departed French Valley 6 hours earlier. The first data point was as the aircraft reached 84 knots, when it would have still been very close to the surface. Coincidentally, the barometric pressure was exactly the same at that time. Subtracting 70 feet yielded an altitude of 1,355 feet, just 5 feet above the actual field elevation of 1,350 feet. So the adjusted altitude data I'll talk about seems reasonably accurate, though it could easily be off by 20 feet or possibly more. On the first approach, the aircraft briefly got as low as 1,465 feet, 135 feet below minimums, which would be just 115 feet above the runway. On a precision approach with a DA or decision altitude, aircraft are allowed to dip slightly below minimums briefly as the pilot makes the decision about whether to land or go around, but this seems more than a brief little dip. As the aircraft began its climb on the missed approach, it barely climbed as it flew down the length of the runway. As it reached the runway threshold, it was at 1,625 feet MSL, 25 feet above minimums. But by the time it reached the far end of the runway, a mile away, it had climbed just 125 feet to 1,750 feet. Meanwhile, it accelerated from 147 knots to 204 knots. So the pilots were flying practically level as they accelerated down the length of the runway. Now, this is a common problem I see with instrument pilots when they fly a missed approach procedure. When they apply power, sometimes they fail to pitch up enough to reach a proper climb altitude. The reason for this is seismographic illusion, which we discussed in detail in episodes 156 and 157, and you can find those at aviationnewstalk.com/156 and /157. In spite of this slow climb, the pilot successfully flew the missed approach procedure and apparently asked ATC to fly the same approach again. Pilots in this situation face a really difficult decision. Should they fly the same approach again and hope for a better outcome, or should they divert to another airport with better weather and a higher probability of being able to land? In general, if you've flown an approach well and didn't see the runway, there's little point in flying that approach again unless you know the weather is improving. Or, if you flew the approach poorly and were too high at the missed approach point, you might reasonably choose to fly an approach again, knowing you'd do a better job of flying the approach the second time and have a higher probability of landing. In this case, the pilots flew the first approach well and were nicely lined up with the runway, though at one point they were over 100 feet lower than they should have been. Perhaps because they were low, they spotted the runway during the go-around, and maybe that gave them hope they might be able to land on a second approach. Regardless, in hindsight, a more prudent choice would have been to divert to an airport with better weather. For example, as the pilots were beginning to fly the missed approach, the weather at San Diego International, just 50 miles to the south, was reported at 10-mile visibility, overcast at 1,700 feet. so the field was VFR. Sadly, what the pilots may not have known was that the weather at the French Valley Airport wasn't improving. It was actually getting worse. The next weather report we have shows that the visibility decreased from 3/4 of a mile to 1/2 mile visibility. And instead of reporting mist, the automated weather station now reported fog at the airport. The ceiling remained the same at 300 feet overcast. This report came out at 4:15 a.m., 1 minute after the crash, and only 20 minutes after the field was first reported to be IFR. At 1/2 mile visibility, the reported visibility was just barely half of the required 7/8 mile visibility for landing from this approach. So while weather was bad for the first approach, it was significantly worse for the second approach. Flying the missed approach to get into position to fly that second approach took about 15 minutes, which isn't atypical. And the data track for the second approach was nearly perfectly aligned with the first approach, with similar altitudes for most of the approach. However, there was a sharp divergence in altitude that began about 1/3 of a nautical mile before the runway threshold. At that point, the aircraft was at 1,525 feet, slightly below the 1,600-foot minimum altitude. However, it began a sharp descent, and less than 0.2 of a mile later, the aircraft had descended nearly 200 feet, crashing about 500 feet short of the runway. The descent was at a steep angle, as if the pilots were diving down for the runway. But why would they think they had reached the runway at a time when their instruments would have displayed that the plane was still 1/3 of a mile from the runway? From the point at which they started to descend, there was nothing between them and the airport except for grass fields, which probably appeared black at night, much like the runway. At the point they started to descend, they passed directly over a rectangular building, which from Google Maps appears to be a biotech company. And oddly, the building appears to have a white roof, though perhaps the sun was reflecting off the roof at the time that Google Maps captured the photo. We'll probably never know why the aircraft increased its descent rate at that point, and the STSB will most likely label this a CFIT accident induced by spatial disorientation. But I can't help but wonder whether these pilots mistook the roof of the biotech building for the white markings on the runway and the grass fields ahead for the runway itself. Also, this accident is a good time to reflect upon what your personal minimums should be. For example, if you were in the same situation where the weather was slightly below minimums, would you still fly the approach to take a peek to see if the flight visibility might be better than reported? And if you did, is there any chance whatsoever that continuation bias might tempt you to fly a little lower than the minimum altitude on the chance that you might be able to land? As you can see, taking a peek when the weather is below minimums could be the first step that might lead you down a slippery slope that results in an accident. And if you did fly the approach once to just take a peek but couldn't land, would you fly the approach a second time? I read a comment online about this accident in which someone said that accidents are more likely to occur on a second approach. I don't know of any data to back that up, but I can think of multiple accidents that occurred on the second or third approach into an airport. One possible reason accidents might be more common on a second or third approach is something we talked about in episode 279, which is continuation bias. As I mentioned then, the FAA's CFIT implied continuation bias sheet says, quote, "Psychologists call the continuation of an original plan, even when information suggests the plan should be abandoned, continuation bias. Pilots more commonly refer to it as get-there-itis. It's an unconscious bias that can appear stronger the closer you get to accomplishing an activity, e.g. approach to landing. A pilot may become so focused on completing their mission that they also overlook serious flight hazards along the way, like elevated terrain or other obstructions, creating the potential for a CFIT accident. Pilots should realize that a diversion to an alternate should be deemed a success, not a failure. Just don't wait too long to divert, as this can greatly limit your options." And consider this. Any pilot who has already flown one or two approaches into an airport and had to go around may be even more invested in trying to continue to land at a particular airport, even when there's strong evidence that they should divert to another airport. Another issue to consider is recency of experience and proficiency in flying to instrument minimums. So, for example, how many times have you flown an instrument approach to minimums or to an airport that was below minimums? And how recently have you done that? I've probably flown to minimums or to an airport that was below minimums fewer than 5 times, and only one of those times was when we were trying to get into a destination airport. The other times were for instrument training when we didn't really care if we saw the airport, as we planned to fly the published missed approach for training purposes. If you haven't flown an approach to minimums recently, would you try doing it in the middle of the night at an airport without an approach lighting system? Hopefully in that situation, you'd find a better alternative and divert to another airport. But here's an even bigger question. If the FAA feels that in the interest of public safety, charter flights and airliners are not allowed to take a peek when the weather is below minimums, why wouldn't you hold yourself to these same higher standards? Just because Part 91 allows you to take a peek, why would you do that when the weather's below minimums? Why, when your life is involved, why would you invoke the lowest FAA standard for your decision making? Isn't your life as valuable as the paying public riding on a charter flight or in an airline? Why wouldn't you hold yourself to the higher Part 135 or Part 121 standards and refuse to fly an approach when the weather is below minimums? I'm sure the main reason that some pilots continue to try to land even against their better judgment is because of the inconvenience and cost associated with diverting. For example, 4 of the people on board the accident aircraft lived in Temecula, which is just a few minutes away from the French Valley Airport. Diverting to San Diego might involve renting a car and other expenses such as landing fees. Plus, they wouldn't arrive home until at least a couple of hours later, all of which would be inconvenient and cost more money. But those potential costs pale in comparison to the loss their families now have to endure. Coincidentally, I received an email from a listener that highlights this kind of tough decision. The email came from Arthur in Arizona, and he wrote, quote, "In all my years of flying, always I believe there was no room for mistakes, just like a surgeon. I remember flying to Dallas from Scottsdale in the Bonanza. Weather called for severe clear, but when we got to El Paso, there was a wall of IMC from the ground up and icing. We were going to the Cotton Bowl. Tickets and hotel were prepaid. We landed at El Paso and got a hotel room. The next morning, the plane was covered in ice, and the forecast was for icing to continue. Turned around and flew back to Scottsdale and lived to talk about it. I have landed out on other occasions and waited for the weather to improve. That's why I believe I'm still around." And I wrote back to him, "Thanks for sharing this story. I like how it shows how willing you were to regard the cost of the Cotton Bowl and hotel tickets as a sunk cost that should have no bearing on your decision about whether or not to continue your flight. The money was already spent, so it should no longer be a factor in future decision-making. I think it's easier for pilots to take big risks when they become blinded by the money they've already shelled out at their planned destination. Not everything works out as planned when we fly GA, and it's certainly not worth dying trying to get to a destination." So Arthur, thanks so much for that letter. Now let's take a moment and review exactly what you as a pilot need to see before you descend from minimums to land on the runway when flying an instrument approach. When flying an approach to an airport with an approach lighting system, upon seeing those lights, pilots are allowed to descend to 100 feet above the touchdown zone elevation. But they're not allowed to land unless the red terminating bars or the red side row bars are also distinctly visible and identifiable. And if there are no approach lights, such as at French Valley, a pilot cannot descend below minimums until they have one of these 9 items in sight: the threshold markings, the threshold lights, the runway end identifier lights or reels, those are those flashing lights, the visual glide slope indicator, such as a VASI or POPI, the touchdown zone or touchdown zone markings, the touchdown zone lights, the runway or runway markings, or the runway lights. Deciding whether you truly have one of those items in sight before descending to land is probably one of the hardest things a pilot has to do. You don't have long to make the decision, and you must be absolutely sure of what you're seeing. As in other accidents we've discussed in the past, this crew may have thought they had the runway in sight when they started to descend, but they came up 500 feet short of the runway, suggesting that they didn't actually have the runway in sight when they started their final descent. And had they chosen to divert after their first missed approach, it would have certainly delayed their arrival home by a few hours, but we wouldn't be talking about it now. The next time you find yourself in a position where the weather is at or near minimums, or you find yourself flying a missed approach because you couldn't see the runway, please remember this accident as you decide what you'll do next. And if you have feedback or insights about this episode or anything else that you'd like to share, please go to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact at the top of the page, and send me an email, and I'll read some of your emails on a future show. and think about what you might pay a CFI for an hour of ground instruction. And if you've learned things from this show that have made you a safer pilot or have helped you pass a check ride, please consider sending a donation. It's easy to join the club and become a member to support Aviation News Talk. Just go to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome and choose the dollar amount you'd like to pledge to support the show. And at the same time, you can read about the things you'll get at different dollar levels. Or you can make a one-time donation at aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. And when you do, I'll read your name on the show. And of course, there's a link for that website in our show notes. And thanks to everyone who supports the show in whatever way you do. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up, and remember that you can always go around.
You can always go around if it don't